Hello, friends. Greg Koukl here on Stand to Reason. I don't start talking unless I hear the cock crow. And actually, that is not even a chicken. That's me about 20 years ago messing around at the KBRT studios. And there's a whole story about the chicken. I'm not going to get into it now. But I am Greg Koukl, the host of this show called Stand to Reason. And thank you for joining me today. Ready to take your calls shortly. Lines are actually full up right now. But just for the record, 855-243-9975 is the number. And I posted last Wednesday, I think, about the Houston subpoenas. Now pretty much everybody knows about this situation where the Houston mayor, Mayor Parker, subpoenaed sermon notes and other things of pastors, and this created a hue and cry. It was related to what is referred to as a Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. HERO, actually, HERO. I think the name of it's a little misleading, but in any event. And the ordinance passed. There was opposition to it because at one point, at least, there was a provision for people who were, and I'm just going to say it this way, gender confused, to use bathrooms that were not consistent with their actual gender, but were consistent with the gender that they actually thought they were. And consequently, there was a hue and cry that was raised regarding the passage of this, and when there was an attempt to repeal it, and there was a collection of signatures, the signatures were turned down as not being adequate in some way. They were disqualified, and whether that's legitimate or not is another issue. That's part of this swirling bit of news that's happening this last week. But in any event, in the midst of this, there was an action that was taken to legally to have the city acknowledge the legitimacy of these petitions and put this whole thing, HERO, onto a referendum coming up in the next vote. And in the process of this, and apparently many pastors were speaking to the congregations about it, the sermon notes of 5 pastors were subpoenaed. And it wasn't just the sermon notes. I'm going to read to you here exactly what was the focus of the subpoena. I have so many papers in front of me here. I got to take a minute or two to find these things. Okay, here it is. The subpoena was part of the case's discovery phase. That's where they're trying to find things out, all right? And the subpoena asked for, quote, all speeches, presentations, or sermons related to the HERO, the Equal Rights Ordinance, the petition, and not just related to the petition, but to Parker, the mayor, to homosexuality or gender identity that has been prepared by or delivered by or revised by or approved by you, the pastor, or in your possession. It was an unbelievably broad request and seemed to many to be a prima facie violation of First Amendment rights. Now, I still hold to that notion. There's been a lot of lawyering going on in the last week, a lot of straining at legal gnats and crossing of T's and dotting of I's, and the administration, Mayor Parker, backed off a little bit. Then she went forward, and there was an amendment that was made earlier in the year, but the amendment turns out to be inconsequential because the legal point, is still in place about the issue of bathrooms, and incidentally, just for the record, maybe I should read what that the original paragraph actually said. And here is what that paragraph in this equal rights, this Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. It shall be unlawful for any place of public accommodation or any employee or agent thereof to intentionally deny any person entry to any restroom, shower room, or similar facility if that facility is consistent with and appropriate to that person's expression of gender identity, close quote. In other words, according to at least the original form of this ordinance, with regards to which bathroom or shower facility you enter, the plumbing you possess does not matter. It is not the decisive concern. What matters is what you think about yourself. Now, I'm not going to take that broader issue on at all. We talked about it here, and I have more to say at other times. That in itself is, I'm just, and this is the law in California. But I just want you to see what's at stake here. Now, that offending paragraph had been removed. And so you think, oh, good. Well, we don't face that problem. No, you still face the same problem because the rest of the wording of the ordinance covers that. And in fact, I'm looking right here at the Free Press in Houston. And the title here, now this is a very liberal rag, very sympathetic to the homosexual concerns. And the title here, when I say rag, I mean newspaper. The title of their piece is How the Equal Rights Ordinance Compromise, that is, losing that paragraph that was so offensive about the bathrooms, is a net positive for the LBGT community. And in their article, they make the point is that the amendment does not in any way, well, this is Parker. They quote Parker saying the amendment does not in any way diminish the protections offered to those communities. That the paragraph spelling out the law for transgender use of the bathroom proved too controversial, had to go because it was stopping conversation around the ordinance. So she got rid of it for political reasons, but the substance of that paragraph is still contained in the rest of the law, and so all of the points still remain. But something else got eliminated, which is why the Free Press in Houston is so happy about the change. They didn't lose anything substantive in terms of liberty for transgendered people to go into other bathrooms. But they gained something, and that is something else got axed in that amendment, and that was a good faith clause. That is, if someone thought that a man going into the women's restroom or shower was not going in there because of his belief that he was a woman inside, but they thought maybe something more nefarious was going on, they could deny him access, and based on the good faith of their thinking that maybe he was abusing this particular ordinance, they would not be prosecuted, would not be actionable. Well, that got axed. The good faith clause got axed. So there is no significant restriction now with regards to bathrooms, even though the paragraph is out. But now a person can't say, you know what, I think you're a phony. I think you have other reasons for going into the women's bathroom. I'm not going to let you in. That's now actionable. No protection. No wonder the LBGTQRSTUVWXYZ community is happy about this, because it gives them more of what they want. Incidentally, just for the record, the ACLU has come out against the subpoena. I mean, that was it must be a very warm day a very cold day in hell when the ACLU is on our side, right? They're making snowballs down there, right? The Americans United for Separation of Church and State are against the subpoenas. They're on our side. How'd that happen? Alan Dershowitz, liberal law professor over at Harvard, is on our side. Now, he's in favor, in principle, of the latitude given in the ordinance, but he is not in favor of the subpoenas. So, we're not barking up the wrong tree here in our concerns, but I want to point to something else here. And because regardless of all the rah that's going on by the Houston mayor and her legal team, that this is all basically legitimate. We might have been a little broad in the way we communicated our discovery concerns with the subpoenas. Maybe we'll narrow it down a little bit, and they have narrowed it a little bit. We're still basically, in principle, behind the whole thing. The mayor sent out a tweet, and here's what the tweet said, and I think this is really revealing. It said, quote, "If the 5 pastors use the pulpits for politics, their sermons are fair game. Were instructions given on filling out anti-hero petition, ? Close quote. So she's concerned that there were instructions given from the pulpit that helped the people be politically active to fill out petitions, which were largely then disqualified, or enough of the names were disqualified. And she wants to go back and see now, because they're getting pushback from the community. Well, maybe these pastors stirred things up, and this is all part of our legitimate discovery. Now, I think this has rhetorical appeal. If the 5 pastors use the pulpits for politics, man, their sermons are fair game, all right? If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. You want to get into the political fight? All right, then toughen up, bucko. We play hardball here. This is the way it works. All right. But I have a couple of questions for the mayor regarding her missive. First, what does she mean by politics? That is, you want to use the pulpits for politics. What do you mean by politics? Do you mean that when any citizen speaks out on a policy issue, that somehow the rules of legitimate First Amendment protected discourse change? Oh, you want to talk on politics? Oh, wow. Now the rules are different. Sure, you have freedom of speech until you use your pulpits for politics. Then the government can come after you with subpoenas. Is this what I'm supposed to take away from that use of the word? Now, I think part of what's going on here is our fault as Christians. I wrote a piece years ago, and you can find it on our website at str.org. It was a solid ground in 2004 called No Hint of Politics. And here I took the title from a statement made by a Christian academic who said that in our interactions as Christians with our community, there should be no hint of politics in anything we do. I thought that was really bad advice. For one, if God's purpose for government is broadly justice, that is the punishment of evil and the praise of good, well, if we're not involved in anything, we're not saying anything, doing anything with regards to politics, no hint of politics, then who gets to inform the content of those terms, good and evil? With God's people out of play by their own choice, if we follow this academic's advice, then those who are not God's people get to define those terms. And when that happens, don't be surprised when good is called bad and bad is called good. That's one consequence of that advice. Here's another one. What happens when the government becomes increasingly invasive into every area of life, such that virtually everything could be called political? And if we're to have no hint of politics in what we say or what we do or how we represent ourselves as Christians, what's left for us to speak to in our larger communities? Huh? Virtually nothing. And then that is nothing becomes the appropriate province of our religious point of view in the public square. And because we have effectively gagged ourselves. And then we shouldn't wonder, it seems, when people say that our religion's not relevant to the real problems people face in the world, because we have backed out. Simply put, they wave the flag of politics, and then we have to wave the flag of surrender without a fight. That's what that point of view leads to. And I hope you realize that the issue of, say, appropriate sexual behavior within Christian communities is now a political issue, right? That whether a person is a male or a female is now not a medical or scientific issue, it's a political issue. Or that what God has joined together, let no man separate, that's become a political issue. That taking the life of unborn children, obviously, political issue. And the list goes on and on and on, and more things are being added to it. And if we can't do politics, then anything, all they got to do is label something political, and we're out of play. And for these people, look, everything is political. And the minute we as Christians get out of politics, that's when we give up our ability to speak to the great human issues that our culture faces. That's when we give up our ability to show that Christianity, Christ, speaks to those issues, speaks to those concerns, the concerns of real life. We give up our opportunity to be light and salt. Worse, we concede completely without a fight that ground to the godless. So my first question regarding that tweet is, what does the mayor mean by political? And it might be that she's just taken her cue from us when we think, well, to be good Christians, we got to stay out of politics. And you want to get into politics, look out. You're going to get what's coming to you. That's what it sounds like when she says, if the 5 pastors use the pulpits for politics, their sermons are fair game. Politics, what's that? Second, what does Mayor Parker mean in her tweet by fair game? Let me tell you something. If those pastors were actually doing something illegal, they're already fair game. But it's not because they were using their pulpits for politics, because that's not illegal yet. But because they were doing something legally actionable if they were. That is something that could be prosecuted under law. And if there's probable cause that these pastors were actually breaking the law, maybe encouraging their congregations to forge or to fake or to falsify or to otherwise corrupt an initiative process, well, then they should be investigated, no question. Or if there's a process of discovery in which they're trying to find something that's highly relevant, that is crucial to the litigant's case, that goes to the heart of the matter. And here I'm using language from the law that governs these kinds of subpoenas. Well, then fine. But that's not what's going on here. I think if those things were the case, then the phrase fair game would apply. That is, you're in if you're doing something wrong. But that isn't what she said. What she seemed to imply is that if you speak to the political issues, that is, if you're in the political arena, then look out. You're fair game. And that then you're messing with us now. But it's beginning to look suspiciously like for Mayor Parker, messing with the law, which is actionable, and speaking on politics, which is not or ought not be, are the same things for her, because she is the law. And messing with her projects is messing with the law. That's what it looks like is actually going on here. This is intimidation, pure and simple. And, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. But these pastors are not running for office. They're not in that kitchen. And if there's no probable cause that they violated the law from the pulpit, which strikes me as improbable to the extreme, or if there is no other way in the process of discovery, or I should say, if there is another way in the process of discovery for them to get that information, and there is, because if the question is whether the petitions have been filled out properly, you go to the petitions. You don't go to the pastors and their pulpit notes. Where am I here? If they are simply speaking in their minds as pastors, instructing their sheep on how to think and act regarding a current policy concern that has relevance for every single person in that congregation, well, then they should be left alone. Remember, by the way, the policy concern that is at issue here. What started everything, and dropping the paragraph doesn't change the legal impact of the larger document. I'll tell you what's at issue. It is whether men should be allowed legally free access to the public bathrooms or showers where your wives and your sisters and your young daughters have gone to seek a kind of sexual privacy from men so that they can relieve themselves or bathe, as the case may be, without distraction and without invasion of their privacy. That's what's at stake. That's what's in question here. And this particular thing, this complaint has absolutely nothing to do with gay rights. Please, someone give me a convincing reason to believe that not wanting men to go into women's bathrooms is somehow anti-gay. Are you serious? And this foolishness is being justified by its proponents like Mayor Parker under the broad banner of equal rights and non-discrimination. Foolishness. And mark my words, friends, and let me just close with this idea. Mark my words. Even if Mayor Parker fails on this, and this whole thing is withdrawn and recalled and changed, this kind of thing that we saw last week is not going away. This is just the first shot over the pastor's bow. Francis Schaeffer said, what is unthinkable yesterday is thinkable today and ordinary and commonplace tomorrow. This kind of thing was largely unthinkable yesterday. But that was yesterday, and yesterday's gone. This is today now. The ice is broken. It's already been done. It's easier the second time than the first time. And even if they draw back, in a certain sense, the precedent has been set. And now I think this kind of government intrusion is thinkable. And we're going to be fighting this same thing many times again in the future. That's my own prediction. Could be wrong on this. But I think it's going to happen. And I also predict that we will not win these battles in court. I don't mean at first. I think we'll win maybe some of the first, but it will keep happening until we start losing, until we run out of funds, until we run out of the ability to stand up to a changing society and a changing legal system, until the laws are so radically changed that we have no legal recourse left anymore. And the First Amendment is so distorted in the thinking of the justices. It's so twisted and corrupted that there's no way we can call upon the protections there to protect us. So tighten your seatbelts. Tighten your seatbelts. I'm Greg Koukl. You're listening to Stand to Reason.
Would you like brief, easily digestible answers to some of the challenges you face as a Christian ambassador? Well, that's why we created our Ambassador's Guide series of booklets. Each volume in this series is designed to equip you with the practical tools you need to understand a topic or area of concern confronting Christians today. With these booklets, you'll receive concise and approachable guides to various philosophies like pluralism and postmodernism, world religions such as Islam and Mormonism, even strategies on how to answer the challenges of the new atheists. To order a booklet from the Ambassador's Guide series, visit our online store at str.org or call 800-2REASON.
All right, friends, Greg Koukl here, and back with you to hear what you have to say. And did my voice just crack just then? I got to write my mom. Mom, 64 years old, I finally reached puberty. There you go. Made it. Scott in Pittsburgh. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Hey, Greg. How are you doing?
I'm doing so-so in light of the frustration of dealing with all of this nonsense in the community. But I better get used to it, and so should everybody else, because this is not going away. So,
yeah, it's kind of crazy. It's getting crazier.
Yeah. So what's on your mind, Scott?
Well, Greg, I wish I had you to ask more than just once a week. All these questions that keep popping into my mind. But I guess I'll just take the one on the top of the shelf right now.
Okay.
I'm divorced, and obviously I'll have to kind of paint the whole thing with a broad stroke, and you won't get all the details. But I'm divorced and currently dating a woman who is also divorced. Her divorce was because of adultery on her ex-husband's part, and but, however, mine wasn't. And so it wasn't my choice for the divorce. I wasn't looking for it. I'm not going to pretend like I'm righteous in it all. Right. It was a toxic marriage, but it was, there was a lot of immaturity and insecurity that ultimately led to her being the first one to give up, basically. And so now 4 years later or so, I'm in a place where I'm thinking about marriage with this woman, and she's a godly woman, and I'm just struggling with thinking clearly on it, because I don't feel like my situation is represented precisely by passages like where Jesus talks about it in Matthew and in Luke. And
what is your former wife? Is she remarried?
No, she's not. She's currently dating someone, but not remarried. And so I'm wanting to think about it clearly. I'm wanting to not be too legalistic about it, but at the same time wanting to do what pleases God and what what is biblical.
There's nothing legalistic about doing the right thing. So I'm glad you made this qualification here. It's sometimes when you have a fairly straightforward teaching in Scripture, and that has to do with behaviors, but it becomes costly. Then people say, "Hey, well, don't be legalistic." And look at Paul writes to Titus that the grace of God has appeared, teaching us to deny ungodliness. So there's not an inconsistency between grace and obedience. I think sometimes we can strain at the letter of the law in a way that causes us to miss the spirit of the law, and that is a kind of legalism that's inappropriate, but that's because we're really missing the main point. So I think this issue of divorce and remarriage is one of the thorniest ones to talk about, because on the one hand, there seems to be what might even be, and I don't think divorce is ever easy for anyone, okay? A marriage is not easy, and rending a marriage cannot be easy. It's the most intimate relationship imaginable, it seems. I just can't imagine any relationship more intimate in that sense. You could say your children, maybe you're closer to your children, but it's a different kind of closeness. It's a different kind of intimacy, and it's not reciprocal in the same way of two equals being joined in marriage. So any marriage is going to be painful, yet at the same time, I think what I want to say is sometimes there's a cavalier attitude about divorce. And so this is a problem on one side. On the other side, there seems to be some circumstances where you have what might be properly called injured parties that are cast adrift being divorced, and those injured parties have no recourse on some understandings of divorce and remarriage, and they didn't want the divorce to begin with, right. And so then that's another extreme, and I'm not entirely. I was just one last sentence here. I have more to say about it, but I'm not entirely always confident or certain how to navigate in between those extremes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to jump in and kind of say specifically what I'm struggling with is in Matthew when Jesus says if a man divorces his wife for any other reason other than porneia or adultery or sexual immorality, then he causes her to be an adulterer or adulteress.
Marries another woman, right? I'm looking at it right now. It's chapter 19, verse 9.
Yeah, and so I guess what I'm struggling with is do I become by even though I wasn't the one who issued the divorce or who wanted the divorce, do I become an adulterer by remarrying then in that kind of sense?
Well, see, that's the question. I think if there is a legitimate if divorce in one's case, if divorce and remarriage turns out to be a morally legitimate option, well, then there is not de facto adultery, even though you're marrying somebody else. But if the divorce remarriage is not legitimate, then it is forcing someone into an adulterous relationship. It's the plain meaning of Jesus' words. And so the hard thing is to try to figure out, well, in which cases is divorce and remarriage allowable. Now, some seem to be straight up, and when there's porneia, and that is the thing that has savaged the relationship, then, as one person put it, adultery has already been committed. Or porneia, which is porneia is a broader term than just adultery, but certainly would include that. So that would be an example of where it seems divorce and remarriage are allowed. 1 Corinthians 7, Paul talks about the abandonment of a believer by a non-believer is what it looks like there, which might be the case if two non-believers were married and one became a follower of Christ and the other one got fed up with that and took off. And then it seems that the injured party there is not under compulsion. He does say, though, if two Christians are married and they are separated, they should remain unmarried or be reconciled. So that's the instruction there. Now, I actually think that there can be more extenuating circumstances than just those two, because I see I realize that there are things called moral dilemmas. That is where you have greater goods that are in play, and so it doesn't say anything about child abuse. I like, especially if the child abuse is not sexual. If it's sexual, you could argue that's porneia, but if it's not sexual, it's just meanness or cruelty or something. It seems like getting your children and yourself out of a physically harmful circumstance would also qualify, because it's the lesser of two evils. And arguments like that could be made where you're choosing the greater good by going away, and so then you ought not be penalized for doing that. Or what about a circumstance where a Christian is trying to be reconciled with his non-Christian wife because out of honor to God here, but the non-Christian wife or the non-Christian partner is not interested and they're off? What if they remarry? To me, if they remarry, then there's no possibility of reconciliation, because then it would require another divorce, you know.
Right.
And so it strikes me that that's a meaningful distinction there too. And so, like I said, I think that navigating between these is very, very tricky waters. And I'm all I feel comfortable with doing is identifying these kind of general concepts here, and then maybe, unfortunately for you, having you navigate the rest of that yourself with counsel who's more familiar with your circumstances. I say unfortunately because I'm not giving you an answer directly to your question, yes or no.
Right.
And but I feel for you in this circumstance, and sometimes I think that, well, maybe these directives that Jesus are given are extreme, and I think that however we manage in this answering this question, if we end up treating the marriage commitment with less gravity than Jesus is treating it, then we're probably having a cavalier attitude about it, even if we're still struggling with it. And the thing that is telltale for me is the way the disciples respond. In verse 10, the disciples said to him, "If the relationship of the man with his wife is like this," what Jesus just said, better not to, you can't, if marrying another woman commits adultery, if it's like this, it's better not even to marry. And then Jesus goes on to say, not all men can accept this statement, but only those with whom it's been given, etc., probably talking about some form of a eunuch for the Lord or something like that. But notice that they, I think, properly understand the gravity of the commitment. That this is really extreme what you're laying down, Jesus. And so if our final analysis of divorce and remarriage doesn't carry with it that kind of gravity, it's probably because we're not cashing it out the way Jesus cashed it out.
Right.
So I don't know if I'm helping you much here, but that's...
Well, it's leaving me in a similar place than I was.
Yeah.
But I understand. I mean, it's the same reason that I keep going around in circles with it, and trying not to be straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. And,
right.
And
right.
But,
and it's so difficult because when we, it's our ox being gored, it's then things start looking different, and it's easier to rationalize and stuff like that. So
right.
I think this is severe. This Jesus teaching is severe. I think it is severe. And this is why, and it's too late for me to give you this advice, but this is why people have to be very, very, very sober in the making of this decision, because for all intents and purposes, exceptions aside, it's a one-way ticket. I think it's really difficult, though. I mean, this is what gives me pause, is when I think there can be something like an injured party in these kinds of relationships, even though Jesus doesn't make that distinction here.
Yeah.
And sometimes one is behind the eight ball, and there's nothing they could do. And
right.
Does that mean then we're cast adrift? And so this is where, there are books that are written on this that you might want to take a look at and see if a more helpful line of thinking presents itself for you.
Yeah, I don't know if I would consider myself the injured party simply because I wasn't the one who made the decision. I mean,
you
in our marriage,
right?
Yeah, we threw that term, the divorce word, around quite a bit, and at the time I was wanting to reconcile, and it just wasn't happening, and so she was the one who eventually filed. But
I just wonder though, if you were both, if at the time when all the struggle was going on, if you were both significantly convinced biblically that if you got divorced, neither of you could get remarried under the circumstances, I wonder if it would have changed the trajectory.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't answer that, and that you don't have to answer it, not to me. But I mean, I just wonder that. And sometimes if we were taught more in our communities to take these things more seriously than we maybe already do, but more seriously, like that. Wait a minute. Okay, you guys want to split up? Great, that's it. You're single the rest of your life. Oh, wait a minute. Whoa. Okay, let's sit down and talk a little bit more, and maybe that would have that influence.
Right.
Okay. Scott, my heart goes out to you. That's what I can tell you right now.
Yeah, well, thanks for your time, Greg. I appreciate you.
Yeah, just go before the Lord and, God keep you, okay?
Will do.
Okay,
all right.
Thanks so much. Wow. Okay, let's take a break. How about that? Greg Koukl, Stand to Reason. Back in a moment.
You can find STR on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, and Pinterest. Interact with STR staff, post comments, get involved with other like-minded Christians. Want to know what is going on with STR? Speaking events, new podcasts, resources, and articles? Follow STR online. You can find all of our social media connections at str.org.
All righty. Greg Koukl here, giving you a piece of my mind as I do every Tuesday night. That's the live show from 3 until 7. No, 4 until 7. 4 minus 7 is negative 4. 7 minus 4 is 3. That's it. 4 until 7. And lots of folk on the line here, so let's talk with Gary in Oklahoma. Okay, Gary.
Yeah, that's right. We couldn't spell mediocre, so Oklahoma's okay. Sorry, it's an old Texas
right.
joke, but anyway.
Good to have you.
Thank you. Listen, I want to talk to you just a bit about a couple of issues related to Calvinism. I'm going to a really theological church right now. It's a great church. Pastor communicates wonderfully, all of that. And he gives an illustration of salvation quite frequently, and I want to run this by you real quick. He said most people, look at salvation as we're in the ocean and we're desperately struggling not to drown, and Jesus throws us a life preserver, and we grab the life preserver and we're saved, right? He said no. He said the truth is we're dead. We're on the bottom of the ocean. We're being rotted away. There are fish picking at our flesh. We're gone.
Did you give me this? Did you call with the same illustration about 3 or 4 weeks ago?
No, never.
I heard this exact illustration from somebody.
Probably
else.
have. It's I'm sure you have.
Yeah.
Anyway,
is that John Piper that gives this illustration? Maybe your local pastors are picking up on
church,
it.
But our pastor
picked up on it.
loves
Yeah.
Tim Keller and John Piper and all those guys.
Yeah.
So anyway, he says, God does all of it. He regenerates you. He lifts you up. He completely redeems you. It's all God's work. There's nothing of you. And a funny thing happens after he gives this illustration most of the time. It's the strangest thing. He asks for a response. And now, we don't normally do, in this particular church, we don't normally do the classical altar calls, but we have prayer counselors down front, and he asks people who are lost and thinking about Christ to come down and talk to a prayer counselor. So my thing is this. Okay, what if they don't respond? Okay, so in other words, Greg, and let me just tie this into the famous tulip illustration. Okay, I don't believe the weak link in tulip is the L. I think the weak link in tulip is the I, irresistible grace.
Right.
Because think about this. Irresistible grace teaches that if you are God's elect, then His grace is irresistible. You will respond, right? Because you can't resist His grace.
That's right.
Okay.
That's the point of the I, correct. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But what is sin?
Is that a rhetorical question, or
No. I'm actually asking you, what is sin?
Well, sin is a lot of different things, but what are you looking for relative to this particular point?
Yeah, you're right.
It's resisting God, right? Yeah,
exactly.
It is resisting God's will. So certainly there are lots of things that we can resist.
Well, I would simply say that it seems to be that 5-point Calvinism classically teaches that before salvation, you can't resist sin you can't resist grace because it's irresistible. However, after you become a Christian, that's precisely how we sin, is we resist grace.
Yeah, but we're
and
talking
we sin.
right. But you're talking about entirely different understandings of grace, or types of grace, if you will.
Okay.
Different way. This is salvific grace. This is redemptive grace. This
Mhm.
is God. This is God, or you could even call it, this is election. That is a function of grace. So
Right.
I mean, I think the problem here is just the way we're nuancing words. It isn't like it's some kind of internal incoherence or contradiction. When it comes to the question of redemption, man is dead. There are lots of different ways to characterize it. And that illustration that you offered is certainly serviceable. That the pastor
Sure.
offers. Okay, and in order for man to respond, to be rescued, God has to do something in a unilateral way that accomplishes the end. And because it is God who is doing it, the end is guaranteed. And what is going on there? Well, it's a work of His grace that's going on, but it's the sovereign action of God that guarantees it. So it is not that man can resist it, because it's something that God Himself wants to do. And I'm thinking here of John 10. Let me page over there real quickly here. And there's an interesting conversation that Jesus is having with the Pharisees, who He makes clear are not following Him because they are not His sheep, because the Father gives the sheep to Jesus. And I'm looking here towards the end of the chapter, so that you may know I understand. Hold on just a minute. Verse 27, my sheep hear my voice. Oh, let's go back to 26. You do not believe because you are not my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and their hear and believe are in parallel. So the hearing of the voice is responding with belief.
Yeah, sure.
And I know them. They follow me, and I give eternal life to them, and they shall never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. Now, the next verse is the operative one for my point here. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. Now, I cited this verse regarding eternal security last week, but the point applies here too. Jesus is arguing for the security of the believer, if you will, or that their stability, because no one is greater than the Father. And even when people say, well, no one will snatch me out, but I can jump out of the hand. Well, you can only do that if you're greater than the Father. Argument being here, it is the power of God that secures this end, which is salvation.
But Greg, on that point, doesn't that scripture simply say that no one can snatch you out of God's hand because it is the Father that secures you?
That's right.
But think about this for a second, though. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is the idea that we cannot resist grace, which is something that I do every time I sin.
Well, keep in mind, it's the grace that we are talking about here. It's not
You're
that
saying
we don't
that
resist, and we cannot resist any grace. We can resist all kinds of grace, but the grace that is in question here, and that is the salvific grace, that is the elective work of God. We can't resist that because it is secured by the power of God Himself. This isn't the irresistible grace in the tulip. Doesn't mean that no grace of God can ever be resisted, because it can. It is specifically, it's almost a term of art. It's specifically referring to the salvific elective grace of God. That's what it's referring to.
How important do you think that is? Because let me give you a context to that question. It is my understanding that Arminius was actually a really good Calvinist who, and on many points, agreed with Calvinism down the line, but simply disagreed in one point, and that was that the Christian, or that the person does have, by an act of the will, a decision to make. And that's the only thing that separated Arminius from
Yeah,
Calvin.
well, I couldn't tell you in terms of the history, but I doubt that simply because the 5 points of tulips were actually individual points in response to, I think it's called the remonstrance of the Arminians. And so this was bang, 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 bang. They were making 5 points in contrast to the theological case that the Arminians were offering. So that's why I doubt that that's the case. But even if it is, it's not. The question is whether he's right on that point. That is, that there is an active will you can make to resist it that will overcome the elective purposes of God. Certainly, people who are non-Christians, as an active will, say no, and Paul makes that pretty clear in Romans 3. There's none righteous, none who seeks after God, blah blah blah. So yes, they are acting in their will to do so. And this is why God himself has to act from his sovereign, the kind intention of his will to act in such a way as to rescue those who otherwise will be lost by an act of their own will.
What do you think about believers, though? And there are many, of course. In fact, if you actually look at the way the practical function of many evangelistic churches, they practically function this way. And I'm talking about, obviously, the largest denominations, et cetera, that are interested. They essentially practice the idea that God is absolutely necessary in order for a person to be saved, that God has to give that person the faith to believe. And he has to give them the ability, I shouldn't say the faith, give them the ability to believe. And in other words, put them in the position where they can, because otherwise the total depravity rules. But that by putting them in that position, they have to actually receive the gift. They actually do have to agree. Do you see anything major? I don't.
I'm missing the point, but I don't see any problem if people are making an appeal for people to decide and to become Christians, and they're giving reasons why that might be the case. We do that. That is not inconsistent with sovereign grace, because God uses the means. He ordains the means as well as the ends. We are to use certain means and to do that well, and then God works. And it's where is the dividing line between God working and my contribution? I don't know. That's a kind of a concursive operation. Both things are going on at the same time, but the end is secured. I mean, because I can't itemize the distinction doesn't mean that the theological point is not legitimate. The end is secured by the sovereign purpose of God. It is completely secured by that. It is guaranteed by that, which is why the Bible calls these people the elect, for goodness sake, because they are elected by God.
So the decision is not really a decision at all. There is no decision. Basically,
that doesn't follow. That simply doesn't follow. And this is where, and I'm jumping in just because we got 60 seconds or less than that, because the music is going to come up in a minute. This is where a much more refined discussion about what it means to decide has to come into play. But what the Reform view is that the will is inclined against God, and so in the rebellious will, man follows his rebellious will. And this is pretty solid. This is very solid biblical anthropology.
Sure.
And until and unless God re-inclines the will. Now the question is, everybody agrees that God's got to do something. The question is, how much does he do? And an Arminian wants to say he kind of sets the will upright so it's kind of even Steven, and then somehow the human choice, the libertarian choice, is the tiebreaker. And I don't think the Scripture teaches that. I think it teaches that God acts in such a way that the will is re-inclined so that the individual actually does choose. It's a genuine choice. It's fully consistent with what they want, but they have been wooed over effectively. Just like when you marry your wife, you marry her because you want to marry her, because you love her, but you never, for one split second, ever chose to be in love with her. That's something that happened to you, and for some people, even against their will, they might describe it, but your response was a result of what happened to you. Yet you still think your decision to choose to marry your wife was yours, and I think it was too. Anyway, tough topic, and I hope I shed some light on it for you. Thank you for the call, Gary. That's it for this hour, friends. One more to go. Stay with us and stand to reason.